Quick question. If you had to choose, would you rather live one life blessed with incredible luck, or experience multiple regressions, but be cursed with terrible luck each time? Let me know your answer in the comments below. Anyway, on to the video. Our story begins with the whimpering cries of an old man. He cries out to the heavens, insisting that he's a civilized man. He's from a civilized world, so why is fate so cruel to him? Amidst his sorrowful cries, a young girl enters his shack, calling out to him. She refers to him as Old Man Seo, and proceeds to explain her reason for visiting. Her mother had boiled some potatoes and hoped they would help get him by. Seo, the pitiful and sad old man, acknowledges their generosity and thanks them sincerely, to which the girl says it was all right and hopes he'll get better soon. She expresses their well wishes again, their longing for his quick recovery, before bidding him farewell. As the girl leaves, Old Man Seo resumes his pitiful cries to the heavens. He insists he's an earthling from a civilized world, so why is he suffering in this foreign world? For 50 long years he's been suffering. Just how long would he have to continue like this? With that grievance in his heart, he tells us a bit of his history until now. When he and his co-workers were on their way to a company workshop, they suddenly got swept up by a landslide, waking up in a strange new world. Unlike the typical isekai stories, their experience was straight out of a horror film. Their first encounter was with a giant fox with 3 tails. The second was a 2-headed red snake who attempted to swallow them whole. And just when they thought things couldn't get any worse, they appeared. Literal mysterious men who could fly and step on the void like it was solid ground. It was at that point they finally realized where they'd ended up. A freaking Shenxia world akin to the Cultivation novels he often read from time to time. The experience was surreal, but even amidst the shock and awe, he quickly realized they were destined to live extraordinary lives. Well, everyone but him. The sage-like beings identified the uniqueness of his co-workers' mythical talents and took each one of them into the sky. Only Director Kim and, of course, himself, who were deemed talentless, were left behind, unworthy of being brought along. Because of that, they ended up in the mortal world, while their co-workers headed into the cultivation world, the world of gods. At the beginning, they had hopes that something remarkable would happen to them as well. However, after waiting in futility, they had no choice but to admit they weren't fated. They weren't talented like their co-workers. Thus, all they could do was toil and labor in this strange world, hoping to survive somehow. 6 months after their abandonment and consequent dive into arduous labor, Director Kim finally had enough and said he was done with that shit. He couldn't keep living like that. He pulled out all his savings and bought a third-rate martial arts book sold on the local streets. Surprisingly, he turned out to be a martial genius who mastered the basics and quickly became a full-fledged martial artist. After that, he worked for the nation, learned more advanced techniques, and finally became a true powerhouse capable of roaming the Jianghu, the martial arts world. Obviously, that led to Seo being left behind again. He thought this time would be different. Just like Director Kim discovered his talent late, he believed he would be a late bloomer as well. Regrettably, fate doesn't move on the whims of a single man. He was painfully talentless, and even until the end, nothing remarkable happened to him. Fast forward decades later, and he's now an old man dying of a simple common cold. He continues to cry to the heavens, asking why his talent was so shitty. But even with that trash talent, he still tried his best to live properly. He learned the language of that world, bought a small piece of land, and built a house. He even made soap, using the proceeds to elevate his life. However, even that was snatched away from him. When bandits discovered the immense wealth from selling soap, they beat him up and stole his recipe. They also booted him from the market, reducing his existence to the wretched state it currently was. After all that, all he's left with is a frail body waiting for his inevitable death. A pitiful death, having been rejected by this world. Seo cries out miserably, asking why he has to suffer so much. Why couldn't he have been chosen like the rest? Even if he wasn't chosen, why couldn't he have lived a decent life at least? Was that so hard to ask for? If only he were stronger. Maybe he could have had more opportunities. Maybe he could have prevented the world from always taking away from him. Too bad it was too late, and all he could do was cry as he passed on. He died so pitifully, even the heavens were moved. Just as his soul reached the netherworld, it was miraculously yanked back, causing Seo to jolt up with a start. He curiously looked around him, wondering what the hell was going on. Weren't these the clothes he wore when he was first transmigrated to this world? Not to mention the familiar faces of his co-workers who had transmigrated there with him. It only took him a second to realize what was happening. He had regressed. Just like his co-workers with their monstrous talent, he also crossed over with a cheat of his own. The power of regression. Thus, his first day of the first regression began. He even did away with the awful hentai protagonist haircut. Low-key, the true reason why his luck was so fucked in the first place. Focusing on his memories, he tried to remember what happened on the first day during his last regression. The memories were so well buried that he failed to realize someone was calling out to him. He was completely lost in his thoughts, wondering what he should do in this regression. Realizing Seo wasn't listening, the caller, John Myung-hoon, grabbed him by the shoulder and punched the shit out of him. He punched him so hard that the co-workers were clearly taken aback. Side note, the maidens might look mid, but trust me, they glow up later on. Trust in the poppy knot, because I've read the novel and I know what I'm talking about. Anyway, enough glazing and let's get back to the story. After punching the living shit out of the MC, Seo Eunhyun, John Myung-hoon towered over him like a typical bully. He asked him what he was doing zoning out after he'd nearly killed them. Was he an idiot? How could he doze off while driving on a mountainside? Seo Eunhyun shot him a confused glance as his memories slowly returned. His 50 years of torture had been so harsh that he now remembered something similar happening in the last regression as well. Back then, he was also punched by this asshole section chief, John Myung-hoon. Normally, such harsh titles are often exaggerations, but in the case of John Myung-hoon, this son of a bitch truly deserved it. He was, in every sense, a bastard. He quickly secured a high position in their company because of nepotism and proceeded to exploit his power. In fact, he was the real reason they were currently stuck in that shit. He had dumped his work on Seo Eunhyun, forcing him to pull Mappa Black Company hours, and eventually causing him to fall asleep while driving. Hence their current situation. Moreover, he was supposed to be the driver, but of course, the Nepo bastard evaded that as well. This realization enraged Eunhyun, especially when he remembered how he handled the situation in his past life. He had bowed to Myung-hoon like a bitch, apologizing for something that wasn't his fault. Matter of fact, all his life, he'd been apologizing. He apologized to the bandits when they beat him up and stole his soap recipe, when a wandering martial artist mocked him and insulted him, or even when a regional official literally robbed him blind in the guise of taxes. He kept on apologizing, too cowardly to raise his head. Regardless, there was one thing he learned during those pitiful moments. He had to keep his head down in front of overwhelming foes. But to those he could handle, he should never lower his head. Thus, he stared straight at Myung-hoon, telling the latter not to fuck around. That wasn't the time to point fingers. Picking up on the insolent tone of Eunhyun's voice, John Myung-hoon lost it and charged in for a punch. He clocked the shit out of Eunhyun, rocking him a bit from the impact. However, our boy had had enough and swung back. He blitzed the hell out of Myung-hoon, shaking off a bit of that Nepo baby syndrome. After the first punch came the second, and Eunhyun shares what makes him different from his co-workers and his past self. He has learned a fundamental truth of this world, and that truth is violence. After being beaten up several times in his past life, he has awoken to this truth. Thus, his psyche can't be compared to a pampered Nepo bastard like John Myung-hoon. If you beat someone hard enough, only 2 words instinctively come out of their mouth, and those words are, "I'm sorry." No matter who they are, they will always crumble in the face of overwhelming violence. Hence, John Myung-hoon's pitiful cries of surrender are expected. Looking down on the bloody Myung-hoon, Seo Eunhyun reaffirms his resolve. He might not be monstrously talented like his co-workers or possess genius martial skills like Director Kim, but he did have one thing he could rely on, and that was the ability to change fate. With that resolve, he slowly stopped letting them fly on John Myung-hoon. The team also noticed this and finally approached the duo. Although they were shocked by Seo Eunhyun's domestic violence no jutsu, they understood John Myung-hoon had crossed the line by attacking first. Thus, Director Kim chewed him out a bit before calming the tension. Capitalizing on the brief moment of peace, Eunhyun quickly apologized to the team. He apologized for rocking Myung-hoon's shit, but mostly for passing out while driving and allegedly leading them to that situation. Director Kim acknowledged his apology by telling him not to worry about it. He was but a man. What could he have done in the face of a natural disaster like a landslide? However, it would probably be best if he didn't put his hands on John Myung-hoon again. Eunhyun nodded in understanding before bowing once again. He did this not because he was sorry, but because he wanted to make a good impression on Director Kim. In a few days, all of his co-workers would be taken away, and chances are that he'd never see them again. However, Director Kim would stay with him somewhat, so it was important to get along. Realizing this, Eunhyun quickly reached out to John Myung-hoon. Since he'd decided to make a good impression, he might as well go the extra mile and help this Nepo bastard. Of course, John Myung-hoon was too full of himself to know what was good for him. He shot Seo Eunhyun a nasty glare, even letting a curse slip from his lips. To this, Seo Eunhyun simply responded with a deadpan expression. He didn't say much, but his alpha aura was enough to make John Myung-hoon fold. What a bitch. Switching to the rest of the group, they set forth to determine their current whereabouts. The plan was to find a village and hopefully determine their position from its location. Regrettably, such a logical move wouldn't be applicable in their current situation. Eunhyun knew for a fact that this world was beyond absurd. Not only did it have immortals flying in the sky and destroying mountains with their spells, the local mortals were also monstrous martial artists who wouldn't hesitate to cut you down in the name of honor and glory. In short, this world was crazy, so expecting logical results from a logical decision was insanity itself. Besides, he already knew where they were. It was a place called Ascension Path, and as far as he knew, there wasn't a single human settlement anywhere near there. Deciding to use his time more constructively, Seo Eunhyun opted out of the location bullshit and suggested setting up a camp. However, Director Kim was still stuck on his bullshit and brought up the company vehicle. Shouldn't they find it at least? They did store a lot of supplies in there after all. To this, Eunhyun could only sigh internally before letting them do as they pleased. The car obviously didn't cross over with them, but of course they wouldn't believe him if he said that. The best move would be to let them find out on their own while he handled the important business. Thus, he quickly suggested splitting up. One team would waste time looking for the car, while he led another to find shelter. Fast forward to the evening, and the group is finally settled. They'd managed to locate a decent cave in which they were currently recuperating. Of course, the other venture was just as Eunhyun had foreseen, a total bust. They didn't find the vehicle, nor did they locate any signs that it had been there in the first place. Ignoring their obvious disappointment, Eunhyun shifted their attention to the present moment. He told the maidens to eat up. He had plenty more nuts where those came from. Unfortunately, Eunhyun's suggestive remarks were only picked up by Director Kim. He glazed our boy, saying he was dependable for finding food and shelter. Moreover, now that he thought about it, the accident really couldn't be blamed on him. He was aware it was Nepo Bastard's fault, for he was the true reason for his late nights and subsequent passing out on the wheel. The maidens chimed in as well, praising Seo Eunhyun for being dependable. If it wasn't for him, their current situation would have been a nightmare instead of the seemingly relaxed camping vibe they had right now. Eunhyun responded to their praises with a curt nod. In truth, most of the miracles he pulled were things slowly discovered by them in the last life. For example, the cave and nuts were both discovered after spending a couple of hours wandering the woods. They weren't his accomplishments, but of course he wouldn't say that. He simply accepted the compliments, finding joy in that fleeting moment of peace. He particularly let the group laugh their hearts out, knowing damn well this would be the last time they would be happy in a long while. True to those words, the next day arrived, and Eunhyun was now shitting himself. He had his head lowered submissively, paying his respects to a giant three-tailed fox. The fox, who was apparently the ruler of the forest, towered over him as it scrutinized his etiquette. It sniffed Eunhyun a couple of times, clearly amazed by his strange, transmigrator aura. As the two were conversing, the rest of the group walked in on the scene and immediately lost their shit. They screamed their lungs out, forcing Eunhyun to shout at them to kneel down. He told them to kowtow and show their respects lest the forest lord got enraged and killed them all. To this, the fox growled menacingly before glaring at them. It had intended to kill them all. But after seeing Seo Eunhyun's etiquette, it changed its mind to demanding a sacrifice instead. The sacrifice was simple. One of them had to offer their arm for it to feast on. This surprised Eunhyun, who noticed just how different it was from his last regression. In that encounter, they'd all panicked and ended up enraging the fox. Because of that, all of them ended up with one foot in the grave. Luckily, things were different this time, and they barely escaped. All they had to do was offer an arm, and the fox would leave them alone. Of course, losing an arm would hurt like a bitch, but what choice did they have? It was either that or death. Moreover, it wasn't that bad because he'd already made preparations, not to mention, any lingering injuries would be healed by the cultivators who would appear 2 days later. Steeling himself, Eunhyun decisively offered up his arm. The fox promptly accepted and bit into it. The pain was so severe that Eunhyun screamed his lungs out. He wanted to pass out, but he couldn't. Not now. Not until the deal with the fox was finalized. Suppressing the overwhelming agony, he quickly reached for the herb he'd prepared beforehand. It was a painkiller of sorts, the kind that would help him cope until the cultivators arrived. Of course, it still hurt like hell, but he quickly hid his strained face from the fox. Picking up on Eunhyun's intentions, the fox ignored him and commented on his taste. What had he been eating to taste that bad? It was actually way worse than the mortals of that world. Well, it didn't matter anyway, because it had already received its tribute. As promised, the group could stay in its territory for 7 days. During that time, they need not worry, because they'd be under its protection. Having said that, the fox immediately left. It stepped on the wind, using the currents to fly away. After it left, the group finally regained their senses and ran to help Seo. They quickly picked him up, carrying him back into the cave. After they did, Seo Eunhyun capitalized on that opportunity to drop some lore. He told them about the new world and about their transmigration. Of course, most of the intel was credited to the fox. It was the best move to make, lest the group started asking questions. After filling them in, Eunhyun brought up the most important issue. It was about the 7-day pact with the fox. As they might have guessed, the pact would only apply for 7 days. After that, they would have to offer something else. Or rather, someone else. Predictably, the revelation spooked the group, but Eunhyun didn't care about that. He quickly excused himself, passing out from the blood loss. As he slept, faint distant whispers slowly woke him from his slumber. He tried to focus on them, and was shocked to realize it was his group talking about him. More specifically, it was the bastard John Myung-hoon plotting against him. The ungrateful bastard was urging the group to turn on him, arguing that he'd already lost an arm anyway. If they offered the rest of his limbs to the fox, they should be able to buy themselves a month at least. He said all this unaware that Seo Eunhyun was hidden right behind him. The Chad had a composed expression, seemingly having anticipated this moment. From the looks of it, shit is about to go down. Eavesdropping on the schemes against him, Seo Eunhyun couldn't suppress the rage welling within. He grabbed a nearby rock, seriously considering whether it was better to smash John Myung-hoon's shit. With the violence he'd mastered in his 50 years of suffering, killing a nepo bastard like John Myung-hoon would be a piece of cake. So, should he kill him? He took a deep breath, calming his impulsive thoughts. Violence wasn't the solution, at least not right now. Even though he could probably bake Myung-hoon's ass, killing him wasn't the right move. Mostly because it would interfere with his plans with Director Kim. If he wanted to leech off the baldy in this life, it was probably best not to act so cruel. Besides, the group was just scared, so he couldn't really blame them for acting out of desperation. Once things calmed down, he was sure they'd regain their senses. True to that thought, the group called out, warning Myung-hoon to shut his hole. If he continued with that backstabbing bullshit, the only thing that would be stabbed would be his back. Pause. The night passed quickly, and soon dawn broke. Just like in the last regression, a giant two-headed snake appeared, demanding a tribute. However, unlike the last time where it sucked Chief O dry, pause, it only requested a small amount of blood. Chief O readily complied, but the outcome was a bit embarrassing. The snake spat that shit out, complaining that it tasted like ass. Actually, hot ass would be a better comparison. The blood tasted that bad. Obviously, this enraged Chief O, but Seo Eunhyun kinda expected it. It was blood from a 21st century worker, full of nicotine, cholesterol, and of course the secret Escobar sauce. It would have been a miracle if it didn't taste like booty. Either way, it was over now, and he could finally begin his plans. Calling out to John Myung-hoon, Eunhyun instructed him to follow along. He was going to gather supplies, and he needed the Nepo bastard's help with that. At first, Myung-hoon was skeptical, but Seo quickly convinced him. He hit him with gaslighting no jutsu and promised to pass on his skills to him. Myung-hoon readily agreed, though he sweated a bit from the pressure. He quickly thanked Eunhyun, believing he was about to get everything he wanted. Catching the slight smile on John Myung-hoon's face, Eunhyun guessed what he was thinking. But unfortunately for the scheming fellow, things wouldn't go as planned. Not only would the fox never show up again, all the knowledge he craved would be useless from tomorrow onwards. However, that didn't stop him from messing with him until things inevitably hit the fan the next day. He quickly pulled him into the forest, barking orders as they walked. At first, it was mild reprimands, but it soon became apparent yelling. He yelled at him for everything, especially when he repeated the same mistakes. It might seem harsh, but this was exactly how Myung-hoon, this bastard, treated him back at the office. He was just getting a little revenge, especially since he wouldn't be seeing him ever again. After putting Myung-hoon through the ringer, they finally discovered something that caught his attention. It was a giant, big boy ginseng. Well, in that world, it was more accurate to call it a yellow bamboo root. It was useless to cultivators, but for ordinary martial artists, it was a divine elixir capable of increasing internal energy. Normally, they were the size of pinky fingers, but because of the abundant energy and ascension path, the bamboo root ended up growing into a giant poppy. With that thought in mind, he immediately saved it for his golden goose, Director Kim. Since he'd decided to leech off the man in this life, it was only right that he invested accordingly. Noticing the golden lightning in the distance, Eunhyun realized it was about time the monsters appeared. He told John Myung-hoon to head back with him. Their destiny had finally arrived. Back at the campsite, underneath the trembling sky, 3 members of the party had collapsed. They each shook violently, overwhelmed by a pressure only they could feel. Obviously, the pressure was from the cultivators, the same monsters Eunhyun had been expecting. After scanning through the mortals, they soon realized that some were immensely talented. So talented, in fact, that they started bickering amongst themselves, trying to decide how they would split the recruits. Before that, though, they decided to test them. First up was the golden-robed Taoist, who zapped the shit out of John Myung-hoon. Apart from being oddly satisfying, it also revealed that he had a divine constitution, the golden heavenly thunder body. Next up was the emo Taoist, who plucked his, or maybe hers, fuck it, let's just say their, mandolin, causing a maiden to shriek in agony. This marked her awakening as another divine constitution, the ghostly yin transformation, immortal root. Last up was the big brute, who swaggered confidently to Chief O. He tested him for another divine constitution, the unique holy body. After confirming that Chief O indeed had the sauce, he immediately extended an invitation, welcoming the 3 to join the Azure Heaven Creation sect. With his backing, the 3 of them had the potential to change the world. Of course, none of that registered to Chief O, who was tripping balls at the immense cultivation pressure. His breathing came out in ragged gasps, making him feel like he could die at any moment. Before the Chad could shit himself in fear, the emo Taoist stepped up, canceling the overwhelming pressure. He then extended his own invitation, promising far more than the first brute. What was it they desired? Immortality? Wealth and fame? The power to overturn heaven and earth? He could give them all of that, so long as they joined the Black Ghost Valley. As the cultivators were bickering amongst themselves, Director Kim tried to cut in, begging the Taoists to lead them out of the forest. Who knew how long they would survive at that rate? However, the cultivators simply ignored him and went about their business. They first stored their chosen recruits, then threw shade at them for being so weak. How had they ended up here with such trash mortal bodies? Noticing that Eunhyun was injured, the giant brute graciously healed him. He'd realized the wound was from a noble sacrifice, an act that struck a chord with him. Even though Eunhyun was immortal, he still commended him for his guts. Done with their business, the cultivators immediately left. bringing their chosen recruits along and ignoring the fact that they were basically kidnapping them. In any case, this was expected by Eunhyun, as the exact same thing had happened in his last regression as well. They were mere mortals. How could they go against the whims of the immortals? He ignored the bitter taste in his mouth and focused on his arm instead. At least they'd healed him before they left. That alone was more than generous of the eccentric cultivators. He looked toward the shooting stars, curious to know what exactly was happening over there. But alas, he was too weak. A mystery left for another regression. After the kidnapping, the day quickly passed, and another dawned. With it came a gloomy, monstrous thunderstorm, a fitting resonance with the events to follow. In the cave, a maiden was undergoing her awakening, likely the cause of the storm outside. Of course, the other members were unaware of this, so they turned to Seo Eunhyun for help. The other maiden, Kim, described in the novel as short and busty, asked if there were any herbs that could help heal her. Eunhyun replied that they should wait a little longer. Someone might show up to help her. As the group mulled over his cryptic words, Eunhyun turned his attention to the entrance of the cave. If things played out as they had last time, then he should be arriving soon. True to his expectations, soft footsteps echoed through the cave, drawing closer to the group. Accompanying the footsteps was a mysterious man, his face hidden in the shadows. Taken aback by this, Director Kim raised his guard and asked who they were. The mysterious man cracked a broad smile and replied gently, he was the Sea Dragon King, Seo Eunhyun. After revealing his identity, the Dragon King Seo Eunhyun chatted it up a bit with the squad. He revealed that the storm outside was due to the Maiden O's awakening, likely a form of storm sorcery. Although he didn't quite understand how that was possible for a mortal baddie like herself, it was undoubtable that she was indeed the cause, especially with the overwhelming power he could feel from her. Banking on the cultivators' assumed goodwill, Eunhyun pressed for some clarity. He asked how they'd ended up there, and why powerful cultivators seemed to pop up like cheap cabbages and take his friends away. Seo Eunhyun didn't answer immediately but laughed instead. After getting a good chuckle from the naive mortal, he enlightened the poor bastard. First of all, did he even know where they were? He explained that they were in a place called the Ascension Path. As he might have guessed from the name, it was a gateway of sorts to ascend to the upper realm. Several powerful cultivators and magical beasts were currently gathered there, all of them waiting for the dimensional rift leading to the upper realm to open. Under such circumstances, wasn't it normal that high-level cultivators would keep showing up, especially if his colleagues were as talented as he'd mentioned? Director Kim nodded in understanding and asked a question of his own. If the place was really an ascension path, and all the cultivators there planned to head to the upper realms, how could they possibly bring his colleagues, mere mortals, with them? Seo Eunhyun explained that there was a technique among high-level cultivators that enabled them to shrink large objects and store them in magic tools. For those skilled enough, they could shrink their entire sects and store them in portable magical items like the one in his hand. In fact, he'd also done the same, and an entire undersea castle of his sea dragon race, alongside 1,800 of his kin, were currently stored in the artifact he was holding. This news shocked the duo, who couldn't help but marvel at how fantastical it was. To think they, as normal mortals from Earth, would get to experience such things. Seo Eunhyun ignored their dazed faces and turned back to the Maiden O. He was truly captivated by her, curious to know what would happen if someone with her peculiar talent joined his Sea Dragon clan. Would she become extraordinary? Well, there was only one way to find out. He moved in to Princess Carrie the Baddie, only to be stopped by Director Kim. The Baldy wanted to say something, but all his strength drained from him as an overwhelming pressure forced him to his knees. It then shifted to his organs, squeezing them with such force it felt like they were about to explode. Lifting the unconscious maiden, Seo Eunhyun declared that he'd be taking her away. He would give her his blood and make her his kin. As for them, he had one important lesson to teach. They shouldn't make a habit of questioning cultivators, especially high-level ones. He answered their questions because he was benevolent, but some of the more eccentric ones would have killed them for merely looking at them, let alone asking questions. It would serve them well to remember that. He ignored the bleeding duo and calmly made his way outside. With a thunderclap, he reverted back to his bestial form and gracefully flew into the sky. After he'd left, the cave settled into a depressing silence until the next day. It was only then that the cruel reality truly sunk in. All their colleagues, no, more like friends, had been kidnapped, and they were powerless to stop it. As the lone maiden reflected on this, her sanity gradually began to slip. She started cackling like a psycho, kind of like your ex when she caught your ass cheating. Oops, sorry. I assumed you even had bitches to begin with. Realizing things were taking a dangerous turn, a psycho baddie turn, Seo Eunhyun immediately consoled her. He told her not to worry, that things would work out somehow. The maiden, clearly delirious with grief, told him not to leave her. She wouldn't be able to handle it if he was kidnapped as well. Eunhyun looked at her with a sad smile on his face. He would have loved to reassure her, but unfortunately, their time was up. As if on cue, the maiden started tweaking, making the oh shit face. A surge of energy burst from her as she cried out, something was coming. Before the Chads could process what the hell was going on, the screaming changed, and this time, it was more ominous. It was here. The strange thing approaching was already there. True to her cry, an old geezer appeared, cackling madly like a psycho. He began talking to himself, debating how the mortals had arrived there. Was it because of the Ascension Gate? Probably. Space often became chaotic when it appeared, and it wasn't unlikely that a couple of random mortals could have been caught in a space storm and teleported there. He arrived at that conclusion and cackled even louder, yelling that he was truly a genius. But that aside, who amongst them had emitted that massive consciousness? He asked while floating closer to the trio. Soon, his eyes locked onto the maiden, the source of the consciousness that made him think an upper realm sage had descended to the lower realm. What a unique find. Noticing the greed and madness in the old man's eyes, Kim tried to intervene but was yeeted away like a bag. He was flung off dangerously, forcing Eunhyun to catch him, his golden goose. However, even with his aid, the two were still yeeted away, skidding on the ground like ragdolls. When they finally stopped their momentum, Eunhyun's back was already a bloody mess. The Baldy felt sad about this, but Eunhyun told him not to worry. Something this trivial couldn't compare to the leeching he was planning to do on him later on. Back to the old geezer, he continued his mad ramblings as he studied the baddie. He planned to take her in, curious to know what would happen if her absurd consciousness evolved into a cultivator's consciousness. The maiden, however, didn't want that shit, and subtly turned her head towards the duo. She called out to the Chads, begging them to help her. Realizing that she was still clinging to her mortal attachments, the mad geezer snapped and attempted to kill the duo. He choked them with a ghost hand, determined to sever any attachments that could hold his disciple back. Kim picked up on this and started panicking. She pleaded with the madman, promising to follow him obediently if he spared her friends' lives. The mad geezer said bet and let them go, but since he didn't want to take any more chances, he decided to teleport them away, so far away that not even he could find them. Since he wanted to sever his disciples' connections, he might as well be thorough about it. He opened a dimensional portal and pushed the duo through it. Eunhyun acted quickly, grabbing his bag. He bid the baddie goodbye, heartbroken as he watched her reach out to him while the portal closed. Once it fully sealed, everything went dark, and he lost consciousness. Fast forward to a while later, and Eunhyun finally came to. He found himself in a deserted alleyway, the chaos of a bustling marketplace reverberating in the background. After analyzing the surroundings, he realized this wasn't the same place he'd been dumped in during his first regression. Things had changed, and he couldn't tell whether that was a good or bad thing. However, despite the changes, certain things stayed the same. For instance, the language being spoken. If his guess was correct, then this was still likely the same country he'd been teleported to last time, which also meant he'd been returned to the very place where he'd endured 50 years of suffering, the capital of Yangguo, Seokyeong City. Fuck. What kind of shitty luck was this?